Behind the calm demeanor and polished presentations, a complex and tightly regulated system governs the daily lives of Jehovah's Witnesses, one that is rarely discussed openly. Their entire belief structure is not only theological but administrative, built on an unshakable hierarchy centered around the governing body. This small group of men, based in Warwick, New York, claims divine authority to interpret scripture for millions of followers around the world. What they say is law. To disagree is to rebel, not against man, but against God himself. This dynamic creates a psychological environment in which questioning doctrine is equated with spiritual treason, fostering a culture where independent thought is feared and compliance is rewarded. Members are not just expected to believe but to conform, to exhibit outward signs of loyalty through conduct, speech, and even thought. Within this system, obedience isn't simply encouraged, it's enforced. And that enforcement reaches deep into personal relationships, even into the fabric of families. In this spiritual ecosystem, control is maintained through a network of congregational elders who act as spiritual watchdogs, monitoring members' behavior with meticulous attention. These elders aren't elected by the congregation, they're appointed from above, trained to ensure that the directives of the governing body are carried out without deviation. If a member is suspected of disobedience, they may be summoned before a judicial committee, a secretive tribunal composed of elders who operate with no legal oversight, no defense counsel, and no outside witnesses. These internal courts can decide a person's fate with a few words. Punishments vary, but the most severe is disfellowshipping, a form of total social exile. The moment the decision is made, the individual is cut off from friends, family, and spiritual community. A daughter becomes invisible to her mother. A lifelong friend becomes a stranger. For many, this silent punishment is more painful than any public condemnation. But the silence isn't limited to interpersonal relationships. It extends to information itself. Jehovah's Witnesses are explicitly warned to avoid literature, videos, and testimonies that criticize the organization. Any content, even first-hand stories from former members, is deemed spiritually dangerous and satanically inspired. This creates an echo chamber where only approved materials are permitted, shielding the faithful from any dissenting viewpoint. In practice, this information control acts like a firewall, isolating the minds of members from alternate interpretations of reality. The internet, though vast, becomes a minefield of forbidden knowledge. Curiosity is dangerous. Reading the wrong book, watching a certain documentary, or even asking the wrong question could mark someone for suspicion. And once suspicion begins, the system is designed to either correct the dissenter or expel them entirely. This method of isolation is not accidental. It is, in fact, one of the organization's most effective tools for maintaining loyalty and preventing mass exodus. Have you already clicked on the like button and subscribed to the channel? This helps us understand that you are enjoying our videos and YouTube is sending you more. We count on your help. Let's go back to the video. Despite this, life inside the Jehovah's Witness community can feel rewarding for those who conform. The sense of brotherhood, the shared mission, the promise of a paradise earth, all create a strong psychological bond. Members are taught that they are part of a spiritual elite, chosen by God to survive the imminent destruction of the world at Armageddon. This belief reinforces a sense of urgency and purpose. Preaching is not just a religious duty, it's a life-saving work. Higher education is discouraged not because of laziness, but because the end is near, and personal ambition is seen as spiritually dangerous. A young person who turns down a scholarship may be praised as faithful. A middle-aged man who gives up a career to pioneer full-time may be viewed as a hero. This mindset transforms sacrifice into virtue and restricts future planning, keeping members tied to the organization's goals. In their eyes, to live any other way would be to miss out on God's blessing, and possibly risk eternal destruction. The grip of this belief system is strongest when someone attempts to leave. Former Jehovah's Witnesses often describe the exit as more painful than the entry. The emotional toll is staggering. Many lose their entire social circle overnight. Marriages collapse. Children become estranged from parents. The community that once offered purpose and belonging now becomes a source of rejection and silence. For those raised from birth within the organization, this loss can trigger a crisis of identity. Who are you when everything you've ever known is stripped away? Many ex-members report feelings of depression, anxiety, and even suicidal ideation, not because of a lack of faith in God, but because of the psychological damage inflicted by sudden social isolation. And still, the official position of the organization remains firm. This is loving discipline, a necessary tool to protect the purity of the congregation. But critics argue it's a weapon of fear, a method to discourage questioning and punish autonomy. And yet, for all the controversies and criticisms, Jehovah's Witnesses continue to grow and operate in more than 240 countries. Their literature is published in over 1,000 languages. Their door-to-door ministry reaches millions. They are organized, committed, and unyielding in their beliefs. But beneath this global footprint lies a fragile structure dependent on strict obedience, controlled information, and social conformity. The question then becomes not just what Jehovah's Witnesses believe, but how their beliefs are used to shape behavior, suppress dissent, and control lives. And perhaps more importantly, what happens when that control begins to crack? When members start to ask questions, seek answers, and discover truths that the organization never intended for them to find. The answers to those questions are not just theological, they are deeply human. Because at the heart of this story are people. People who believed, people who obeyed, and people who dared to walk away. From behind closed doors, a hidden reality begins to emerge. While the image projected by Jehovah's Witnesses is that of moral integrity and spiritual discipline, investigations across several countries have uncovered disturbing practices regarding how the organization handles abuse allegations. Central to this controversy is their adherence to the two-witness rule, a doctrine stating that any accusation of sin, including child abuse, must be corroborated by at least 2 eyewitnesses. In the context of abuse, this requirement becomes an almost insurmountable barrier, since such acts are often committed in secrecy. The result is a system where victims are silenced, predators are shielded, and justice is delayed, or completely denied. In nations like Australia, the UK, and the United States, this internal handling of abuse has come under intense scrutiny. The Australian Royal Commission found that over 1,000 cases of abuse had been documented within the organisation over 5 decades, yet not one was reported to law enforcement. Despite mounting lawsuits and governmental pressure, the organization maintains its stance. Spiritual matters should be resolved within, away from what they term worldly institutions. But the layers of control extend far beyond judicial matters. In the world of Jehovah's Witnesses, personal development is often at odds with spiritual devotion. One of the less publicized yet profoundly impactful restrictions is their view on higher education. While not outright forbidden, university attendance is strongly discouraged, framed as a spiritual danger that could lead young people astray. Members are repeatedly reminded that academic ambitions could expose them to worldly thinking and compromise their faith. Instead, they are steered toward part-time or low-responsibility jobs that allow for greater involvement in congregational activities, particularly preaching. For many, this translates into a life of financial limitation and lost opportunities. Former members often speak of the hardship they faced upon leaving, struggling to build a career with no formal qualifications, while also trying to rebuild their personal identity after years of mental conditioning against pursuing personal dreams. Relationships, too, are subject to heavy doctrinal control. Marriage is treated not just as a sacred bond but as a loyalty test to the faith. Jehovah's Witnesses are encouraged, often pressured, to marry only within the religion. Those who choose a partner from outside the organization may face disciplinary actions, including disfellowshipping, which results in complete shunning from the community, including one's own family. The doctrine reinforces a patriarchal structure. The man is the head, the woman must submit. Divorce is permissible only in the event of adultery. Emotional abuse, neglect, or severe incompatibility are not considered valid reasons. As a result, many remain trapped in toxic relationships, discouraged from seeking safety or peace for the sake of maintaining spiritual standing. Women bear the brunt of these limitations, denied leadership roles and barred from speaking or praying in the presence of men, regardless of their wisdom, maturity, or spiritual insight. Even in their most active roles, door-to-door preaching or teaching, they operate under male oversight, a constant reminder of their secondary status within the faith. Yet, to outsiders, Jehovah's Witnesses often present the facade of unity, morality, and divine harmony. Members are taught that the congregation is a haven in a world filled with evil and confusion. But behind this carefully maintained image lies a cost few are prepared to pay: the loss of personal freedom, suppression of questions, and surrender of individuality. Total obedience is expected, and loyalty is measured not by belief alone, but by visible and quantifiable works, especially through preaching. One of the most iconic practices of Jehovah's Witnesses is their door-to-door ministry. Inspired by their interpretation of Matthew 24 verse 14, every baptized member is required to participate. This is not optional. Each person must track the hours they spend preaching and submit a monthly report to the elders. Failure to meet expectations often results in reprimand or spiritual counseling. For many, especially teenagers and introverts, this can become a source of deep anxiety. They face doors slammed in their faces, insults, and sometimes even threats. But the organization frames this as a test of faith. Suffering for Jehovah is seen not as a burden, but as an honor, and every rejection is spiritually romanticized. The expectation of sacrifice becomes a central theme. Members are taught to put Jehovah, and by extension the organization, above everything else. Career goals, personal relationships, even medical choices are subordinated to religious loyalty. Perhaps the most extreme example of this is the well-known refusal of blood transfusions. Based on their interpretation of scriptures like Leviticus 17 verses 10 to 14 and Acts 15 verse 29, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that accepting a transfusion is tantamount to spiritual suicide. In countless documented cases, individuals have died after refusing life-saving procedures. Hospitals around the world have developed alternatives, but these are not always feasible in emergencies. Former members have revealed how they were pressured into signing legal documents refusing transfusions before surgeries, even when doctors warned that their lives were at risk. It's a decision made not in a vacuum, but under the weight of spiritual guilt, community pressure, and fear of eternal consequences. The control extends into mental health as well. While not officially banned, seeking psychiatric help or using medication for anxiety and depression is quietly discouraged. Members are taught that emotional struggles should be addressed through prayer, Bible reading, and spiritual devotion. This results in many silently suffering, afraid to be labeled as weak in faith. Even when therapy is acknowledged as an option, the cultural stigma within the community remains strong. The constant pressure to appear spiritually strong, happy, and faithful creates an environment where vulnerability is dangerous. The lifestyle imposed by the organization is rigid. From the music one listens to the way one dresses, to who one spends time with, every aspect of life is governed by unspoken and spoken rules. Romantic relationships are especially monitored. Dating can only occur within the organization and must be with the intention of marriage. Casual dating is frowned upon, and any deviation can result in interrogation by elders or even judicial action. The narrative of the Jehovah's Witness experience begins with a rigid structure of courtship and marriage, where prolonged relationships are discouraged and early marriage is encouraged to avoid what is seen as moral temptation. The organization upholds a strict interpretation of Ephesians 5 verses 22 to 24, teaching that the husband is the head of the household and the wife must submit to his authority. Although domestic abuse is not officially condoned, the reality many women face is different. Even in toxic or abusive environments, they are often advised to remain with their husbands unless adultery has occurred, one of the only acceptable grounds for divorce according to the organization. This leads to heartbreaking situations where women, seeking safety and peace, are instead labeled rebellious and ostracized by the very community they once trusted. From childhood, young Jehovah's Witnesses are immersed in a lifestyle vastly different from their peers. They are taught that the outside world is corrupt and spiritually dangerous. Participation in common celebrations like birthdays, Christmas, or Halloween is strictly prohibited. At school, these children are often isolated, unable to join extracurricular activities that might connect them with non-believers. As they approach adolescence, pressure mounts to be baptized, an act that solidifies their status within the organization. But once baptized, even teenagers are held to adult standards. If a 15-year-old questions a doctrine or dates someone outside the congregation, they risk disfellowshipping, a punishment that includes being shunned by friends and family. The emotional toll is profound. Many young people who leave report symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression as they face a world they've been conditioned to fear. Despite these harsh realities, the organization continues to grow, driven by its tight structure and the sense of belonging it offers. For many members, being a Jehovah's Witness means stability, purpose, and the promise of salvation after Armageddon. But this promise comes at a price. Leaving the group is not just a religious decision. It is an act that disrupts every aspect of a person's life. Former members describe the departure as emotionally shattering, often forced upon them by internal conflict, doctrinal contradictions, or abusive experiences. Their decision is not driven by disbelief alone but by the urgent need for emotional and mental survival. What begins as a whisper of doubt becomes a storm of questions. Why do the end-time prophecies remain unfulfilled? Why is there such a strong emphasis on control? Why is separation punished more harshly than abuse? As doubts grow, many begin to quietly withdraw, missing meetings, pulling back from duties, avoiding public scrutiny. But even a silent exit can trigger disfellowshipping, as the organization sees inactivity as spiritual danger. Others choose a formal resignation, writing letters to their congregation's elders. This immediate, final decision results in instant disassociation. From that moment forward, no Jehovah's Witness is allowed to speak to or acknowledge them. Stories of families shattered overnight are tragically common. Mothers telling their children they are no longer welcome in their homes. Siblings cutting all ties. Lifelong friends turning their backs. One former member recalls the moment her mother refused to hug her goodbye. Another woman shared how she went from a full social circle to complete isolation in a single day, forced to relearn how to live from scratch. This isolation is often compounded by a lack of practical resources. Since higher education is discouraged, many who leave find themselves unequipped to join the workforce. One man who left the faith at 35 described waking up to the terrifying reality that he had no degree, no career, and no contacts outside the congregation. He had spent his life preparing for the end of the world, not for a sustainable future. And yet, amidst the darkness, there are signs of hope. Support groups around the world, formed by former witnesses, offer psychological help, legal guidance, and perhaps most importantly, community. These groups serve as bridges to a new life, where former members rediscover themselves and their freedom, slowly building a new identity not defined by fear or rigid control. Rebuilding after leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses is a journey of rediscovery. Many struggle to define themselves after a lifetime of being told who they are and what to believe. Some find solace in new forms of spirituality. Others step away from religion entirely. What unites them is the desire to live without the shadow of divine punishment looming over every decision. A man who spent 4 decades as a Jehovah's Witness put it this way: "For the first time in my life, I can think for myself. I can talk to who I want, read what I want, make my own decisions. It is a freedom that once seemed dangerous but now feels like healing. Still, the battle is not over." In many regions, the organization holds significant influence. Reports of abuse cover-ups and enforced shunning continue to surface, even as former members strive to bring light to these hidden injustices. Some governments have begun responding. Russia has gone as far as to ban Jehovah's Witnesses, labeling them extremists. Other nations have issued fines for the organization's failure to report child abuse. Yet, for most, meaningful justice remains out of reach. The emotional weapon of shunning continues to silence many who would speak out. Still, the tide is shifting. Thanks to documentaries, interviews, and online forums, former members are finding their voice. They are exposing a system that, for years, operated quietly behind doors of loyalty and devotion. And now, society is being forced to confront the difficult question: at what point does religious faith become coercive control? How far should a religious organization be allowed to regulate the lives, choices, and relationships of its members? The global conversation surrounding Jehovah's Witnesses is far from over. For some, the faith represents a sincere commitment to moral purity and a devotion to God. For others, it is a system of control that suffocates individuality and punishes autonomy. What is clear, however, is the deep and lasting impact the organization has on those within and outside its walls. Through this exploration, we have uncovered the beliefs, the rules, and the invisible walls that keep many from walking away. But as more voices rise, telling stories not of rebellion, but of survival and rebirth, the narrative is beginning to change. The question now is not whether people will continue to leave, but whether the world is ready to hear what they've been through, and to help them heal.